Heading south of the Mason-Dixon, this is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 319, covering the week of August 1st through August 5th, 2022. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Gab page, and subscribe to our YouTube page. You can find all kinds of great videos at the YouTube page. In fact, if you go there and you like the videos, click on that little super thanks button under the videos. You do contribute to the Institute when you do that. But of course, a great way to contribute to the Institute is go to abbevilleinstitute.org, ABBEVILLE, institute.org. Click on that donate button on the page, and you can send us a tax-deductible donation. You can donate monthly, annually, or a one-time gift. We do appreciate all that you do because all of those donations keep the Institute going, whether it's this podcast, the website, all of our programs, our videos. All of these things cost money, and they cost a lot of money. So we do appreciate when you can support us in any way possible. While you're there at the abbevilleinstitute.org, give us an email address. We'll give you a free ebook exploring the Southern tradition. You'll also get on our email list, and of course you get our daily dose of Dixie. Usually comes Monday through Friday. Sometimes we don't do it every day, but usually Monday through Friday. It's a great way for us to keep in contact with you. It also is our way to let you know about upcoming events, like our Zoom webinars, which we did a couple of weeks ago. They're fantastic events, and if you don't know about them, you can't get on board with them. So make sure you get us that email address so we can communicate with you. Do not unsubscribe. We do send out an email sometimes once a day, sometimes twice a day. But I know that's a lot, but make sure you stay on that email list so you can know what's going on with us. Also, download our free mobile app. Just go to your app store and download the app. That way you can get the Institute on the go. It's free of charge. You can also go to abbevilleacademy.org, abbevilleacademy.org. If you missed any of those Zoom webinars, you can pick them up there, and they're great. We've got, I think, 16 or 17 of these Zoom webinars now that we've done. So those things are fantastic, and of course, that also helps support the Institute when you buy one of those Zoom webinars. Lots of great ways to support the Institute. Also, buy our material, our apparel at abbevilleinstitute.org. Click on the shop tab. You can get our logo and all kinds of interesting apparel. It's high-quality embroidered material. So that's a great way to support the Institute. And as always, rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. Let people know you like it. Also, share our articles around on social media. We're not on Facebook, but you can share our material on Facebook, and that does help expand the audience and let people know what we're doing. All of your support is greatly appreciated. All right, let's talk about the week at the Institute. Lots of good stuff this week, and I want to start with this idea of the South as an abstraction. And we deal with that even now. The South is an abstraction. Most people think about it as an abstraction. It's not. It's just kind of this thing, right? The South, and they get an image in their mind, and you find that, right? It doesn't matter if you're outside of the South. When you say the South, immediately something is going to come to mind for someone in the United States, particularly those that have never been to the South. So to them, I mean, it's an image, but it's also an abstraction. Everything the South has is an abstraction. So if you take the issue, for example, of slavery, it's an abstraction to most people. It's just this abstract thing that they don't. It's not a real tangible thing. Now, unless they've seen some images or they've seen some of the horrors of the institution that were photographed or depicted in some way or another, they might have an image in their mind of that, but still, those are still oftentimes based on abstractions. Or if you think about the plantation, right? There's an abstraction of a plantation. There's an abstraction of a farm. There's an abstraction of a Southerner, a Confederate soldier. There's an abstraction of that time period. But the South, of course, is 400 years, so there's a lot of things in that. Maybe it's not just those things. Maybe it's a New South abstraction, or maybe it's an 18th century abstraction of the South. So the South is often to people around the South an abstraction, but the people that live there, it's a real tangible thing, and it is something that has meat to it, right? They can chew on it. It's something real. And this is where we often run into problems in the United States because Americans often deal in abstractions. If you believe that the United States was founded on a proposition, as the Republican Party made clear they did in the middle of the 19th century, then the United States itself is even an abstraction. It's a line from the Declaration of Independence. It's just an abstraction. It's this idea that all men are created equal, and that's what America becomes. And so the South had long dealt with that issue negatively. I mean, they didn't really. They wrote a lot in, of course, the middle of the 19th century as the Republican Party made it clear that that particular line was going to be the basis of their political ideology. Again, ideologues, abstractions. The South often wrote about it negatively and saying that we don't believe this, we don't believe that line, we don't believe any of this. And people, of course, have criticized Southerners for doing this. But they didn't deal in abstractions. They looked at things in their mind that were concrete reality. They called, this is an apple, and an orange, and they thought that the reality was not what the North was saying, but was what they were doing. So you even take an issue like Uncle Tom's Cabin, the book, and you had Southerners like William Gilmore Simms, who we talked about last week, writing the anti-Uncle Tom's Cabin novels. And to them, Uncle Tom's Cabin was an abstraction, whereas what they were writing was real, right? So they often believed they dealt in reality. Northerners dealt in abstractions. Even Calhoun, when he stood up and gave his positive good speech in 1837, said, "I'm not defending slavery in the abstract. I'm defending it as it actually exists." And I was having a conversation with a colleague the other day, and he said, well, if you look at Calhoun's positive good speech, in some ways it's just a take on the necessary evil position, even though he calls it a positive good. It's the same thing Jefferson essentially was saying at the end of his life when he said he had the wolf by the ears and we don't really know what to do with it. We can't get rid of it, but we cannot let it go either, because he didn't believe, of course, that former slaves could be integrated into society. And so Calhoun's position was that he didn't believe that former slaves could be integrated into society at that point. So they had to do something with it, and it actually had, in his mind, a civilizing effect on African populations. And a lot of Americans believed this in the 19th century. It wasn't just in the South. So in their mind, they're looking at things in reality and not abstractions. Well, the piece that we ran on Monday, and then also the piece we ran on Thursday, deal with this a little bit. And the piece on Monday by Carrie Roberts is actually a lecture from our 2004 summer school, and it talks about religion, and the title is "The Religious Foundations of a Redeemer," and how there was this abstraction of the North, and then there was the reality of the South. And the abstraction became a cultural nationalism. And he says, and this is not just in the South, it's also in places like New York, which he brings up. And he brings up the people like Washington Irving, who really didn't like Yankees, or James Fenimore Cooper. All these people that had this resistance to a New England abstraction of society. And when you look at people like Charles Sumner in the 1850s and then the 1860s, he made it very clear what they were trying to do was remake America in their vision, a New England vision. They thought that America needed to be New England, not something else. And so that's what we have to understand. When we publish pieces like this, we publish them under the topic of Northern Studies. You see, if there's any section of the United States that needs to be studied in detail, it's really the North, not the South, because the North was this peculiar place that dealt almost entirely in abstractions. It was something that they did, even if you go back to the 17th century. And they had this concept of a city upon a hill, right? George Winthrop, or Winthrop as Puritans would have called him. They had this, it was an abstraction, right? We have this thing that we're striving for, this city upon a hill. And here it is out there, and we need to bring this into America. And everything around us, I mean, this is a very negative way to look at things. It was always a utopian vision in some ways. The reality of where they existed wasn't ever good enough. Puritans, they need to purify the church, right? So the Anglican Church, it was never good enough. What they had was always lacking, and it needed improvement. So that's an abstraction. And they look at the South in this very way. they looked at America in this very way. And so it was always, a goalpost was always moving. And there's never an end game to this. You're never going to have salvation on earth. It's always going to be moving. There's always improvement. This is progressivism, essentially, modern progressivism, the way we think about it today. And so this really interesting piece gets into that, right? These abstractions and how these abstractions fostered this bubbling up of political problems in America, and the resistance to the South, the resistance to America as it existed. It was always in need of improvement, whereas a lot of Southerners didn't think that way. In fact, you could say there were some Southerners that thought that way. I mean, you can't say this. The South is not monolithic, right? I mean, we know this, right? There's not just one South. There's many different Souths, but the Southerners in general did not really deal in abstractions. And there's this piece on Thursday, part 3 of Chase Steely's review of the attack on Leviathan, has a part in that I think relates back to that position. And this is a quote from that book, and this is Donald Davidson, and he says this, quote, "It will not be easy to convince the Southwesterner that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness can be reduced to such pale equivalences as are represented in statistical tables. Not for such equations was he born of Highland, Scottish, or English blood. Hardly can he, of all men, be expected to keep a straight face before such hieroglyphs. Only for manners' sake, and that in very high company, will we refrain from laughter. What do such abstractions mean when he strides away from office or field, with the sun on his shoulders, and looks at the hills, whose every fold in the blue distance both hides and discloses lands that are still golden, whether one seeks them for refuge or adventure? Here, though, there be old battlefields at every step, or new highways riving the green with a scurry of motors. No fatality broods, but every prospect invites with the notion that happiness is not only pursuable, but tangible. Happiness is not only pursuable, but tangible. It's a real thing. It's not an abstraction. One only has to pitch his house on a fair piece of rising ground in a grove of oaks or hackberries, and happiness is already touched. Let there be a fence around the grove with a gate that opens up upon a boxwood walk leading to a high column porch. And between fence and road let there be a pasture for the horses, with a creek flowing in it, and limestone outcroppings, and ironweed scattered about. Who cares? And blackberries in the fence corners. Let there be fields of corn to left and right, and beyond them a high hill, well forested, a range of turkeys, only half tame, and for possum and coon that are wholly wild." That is the important part of that story, right? The South was never an abstraction. It was a tangible thing. It was contentment. And I think that's something that we all struggle with, being content where we are. But this is contentment. It's just this thing. You have this house in this beautiful place, and you're looking at the mountains. You're content. It's not an abstraction. This is reality. And Southerners lived in a very tangible place without dealing in abstractions, theories. Even their political, quote-unquote, theories were based on concrete, tangible things. What they saw as happening, they reacted. So you could say, I mean, this is where you get into our Southerners just reactionary. They reacted to the outside forces, whatever it was, being applied by something else, and they reacted in a tangible way. So Calhoun's concurrent majority is a tangible reaction to real problems, which was, of course, what he saw as unconstitutional government. The North is abusing the Constitution, so there's a tangible reaction. You could even say the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are that exact thing. This was a tangible reaction to something that was going on from the general government, being forced upon them by the general government. These are tangible things. And so when you have a dichotomy like that, right? You have people dealing in abstractions, and then you have people dealing in tangible things. It makes the Southern tradition become much clearer for people to understand. This is why we've said on this show, and we've talked about on the website, and of course in conferences and everything else, and this is something that Clyde Wilson often said, there needs to be a Northern Studies program somewhere. The South was tangible. It was the North that was this strange thing that dealt in abstractions, and nobody really liked. I mean, you think about how many people in America did not like New England, and yet somehow New England has become the model for America. And all of the evils that flow from that, whether it's in foreign policy, domestic policy, whatever it is. New England is the place that people don't like. Even New Englanders themselves don't like it, which is why they all moved to the South to try to get away from it. Now, there's some really interesting things about New England. It's a quaint place. It's there are beautiful little towns, beautiful scenery. I mean, there are some beautiful things about New England. In fact, some of the agrarians moved to New England because they liked this very small community that it fostered there. They liked that environment. And this was always a critique of the South. It didn't foster community, as when I say community, towns. There weren't many of those. So if you like that kind of environment, you're not going to have it in the South. It was more spread out, right? So there's other things going on here, but certainly this love of place and people, you find it in New England. I mean, New Englanders are they're very provincial, just like Southerners are in a lot of ways, but Southerners loved where they were from because they could see here. It wasn't just an abstraction. It was reality. They loved where they were. I mean, Nathaniel Macon loved his plantation. It was his country. His plantation was his country, not North Carolina, but his plantation was his country. He didn't leave it. He went there for months on end and didn't leave his plantation. He didn't need to. He had a chapel there. He had everything he needed there. He checked his mail once a month. He didn't need to go anywhere else. His plantation was good enough. And so I think this is where, we lose sight of what that Southern tradition actually meant. I think it can be boiled down to a term, and it's, again, something that all of us struggle with, I think, at times, and that is contentment. Southerners were content in their traditions, and they didn't want anybody changing them. Now, you could say that there's a whole other side to that, and people get into the race issue and everything else in the South, and there were some Southerners that weren't content. This is true, right? I mean, we do have that back and forth. So there is all of that. But when you look at, we'll just say the white South in the Southern tradition, there was an element of contentment, and they didn't like having outside forces change that. And so this is why they didn't deal in abstractions. Now, this could be applied, again, to all kinds of different things, and it's just such an important thing to understand, and that's why I like this piece, and I like this piece by Chase Steele, and also the piece by Carrie Roberts, which gets into this this discontent coming from New England. Now, a couple other great pieces this week, a couple of pieces of notice. The first is by Ryan Walters, and this is the first part of a two-part series on Lord Lyons, who was writing back and forth. He was the British ambassador, Lord Richard Lyons, and he was writing to Foreign Secretary Lord John Russell and talking about what was going on in America between 1859 and 1861. And Lyons, as were many of the British, was anti-slavery. And this is, of course, why the British ultimately failed to recognize the South. It was Queen Victoria. She was, and her husband was also Prince Albert. They were both anti-slavery, though, of course, you can see the hypocrisy and all that because the workhouses and other things in Great Britain were horrible, right? They were basically slavery. But they were anti-slavery, and they could not saddle up to a government and to an entity that was pro-slavery. And I mean, the South generally was pro-slavery. It was a slaveholding republic. So was the North, by the way, but the South was certainly not interested in the abolition of slavery, and they considered the North to be anti-slavery, though Lyons said that he didn't really think that the Republican Party would abolish slavery. They thought that they would try to keep it out of the territories, which is, again, what this all comes down to. This idea of why slavery, wasn't it, again, to most Americans, it wasn't an abstraction. It was We don't want slaves in the Western territories. It was a practical thing to compete with us for our labor, and we don't like black people, and so we want them out. That's what most Northerners thought of slavery. We want states that are anti-slavery because we don't want the competition. It was a practical response to the institution. There were people that dealt in abstractions, namely the abolitionists, and there were also Southerners who dealt in abstractions, at least at times. Some of their arguments, like Fitzhugh, his arguments were very abstract when it came to ideology, when it came to pro-slavery. So you started developing this pro-slavery ideology, which you can find, of course, influence from Northern theologians and others. But as you see the 19th century develop, there is an ideology behind it, not just an abstraction, not just a concrete defense of the institution anymore, but dealing with a little more abstraction. So you had that, and Lyons was writing back and forth about politics in the United States. And this is a very interesting period of time, 1860, you get the election and the split of the Democratic Party. And Lyons, though, even though he was talking about, he thought the slavery issue, he downplayed it quite a bit. And this is important because most Americans did downplay the slavery issue when it came to real tangible things that were on the table, again, that were going to affect, say, the British. And the most important thing was the tariff. So Lyons thought the Republican Party would be dangerous for Great Britain because of its insistence on the tariff. And he thought the Democrats would be more acceptable to the British because of their position on the tariff. So for the British, the slavery issue was secondary to the tariff. And we know that when the Democrats bolt the Congress early in secession winter, the Republicans pass the moral tariff. Right? And so the moral tariff was a high protective tariff. And Lot Morrill, who wrote the tariff, was one of the radical Republicans. And he was certainly, this is something they did. They created their political agenda, they crafted their political agenda and ran it through Congress very early on in the war. It was things like tariffs and federally funded internal improvements and banking legislation. All of that got promoted during the war, right? And it just stayed because there was no longer a democratic opposition to these things. So they got what they wanted, which was remaking America in the image of New England. That's exactly what they wanted to do when they came into office. And of course, Lot Morrill is from Maine. So you have this political side, this political remaking of America, a financial and economic remaking of America. It's all there. It's all there. And when you read this piece, and we had somebody comment, well, wait a second here, I just read this and I thought the war was not about slavery. Well, it's not really about slavery. The war is never about slavery. It was about keeping the South in the Union. It was always about keeping the South in the Union. And ending slavery was a byproduct, and it was a war aim, ultimately, later on in the war. But not at the beginning of the war. And certainly most Northerners didn't go off to fight in the South to free slaves. So this is something that just happened later. It was a byproduct of the war. Now, Lyons said this, which I found interesting. There was a quote. Ryan Walters says this, but if secession became an established fact, Lyon could at least find a silver lining for England. If they could do it quietly, you might in some respects gain, as they would in all probability establish a low tariff, and throw themselves paternally into our arms, if we would let them. One cannot but tremble at the idea of serious troubles in the southern states, which we are so entirely dependent upon them for cotton. So he's saying, look, this could be a good thing. They would have a lower tariff, and maybe we could bring them into us, right? This could be something that we can embrace these southern states, and they would be one of us. So that part of this, and looking at that, and there's going to be a part two, and we'll get into some other things that Lyons says. So that's really interesting. Then you have, of course, the piece on Wednesday, Nascar Goes Sissy, by Paul Yarborough. He always has funny titles. But this idea that, NASCAR is going to be looking at electrifying stock car racing, which is interesting. Or stock cars, electric motors have a tremendous amount of acceleration. There's nothing, people know that. If you've ever driven an electric car, been around electric cars, they go really fast, really quickly. But can they maintain the speed And NASCAR has talked about this. They can't have long races. I mean, the cars are going to run out of batteries. They have to figure this out. So, but this is betraying the origins of NASCAR, which was these kind of alcohol fueled bootleggers and building these fast cars, and how that was so important. So this is a piece more about the influence of whiskey and other things on the South, and these bootleggers and these moonshiners than anything else. It was kind of a resistance to the central authority, whereas if NASCAR creates electric cars, they're just bowing to the establishment and not really being against it anymore. And I think that's something that cultural resistance, the dissidence that the South often offered as well, that people found interesting about the South. And when you just capitulate and you become what the establishment wants you to be, which is electric cars, we don't want to have noise pollution and air pollution, all these things. You capitulate to the agenda, to the leftist agenda, for no reason except maybe you think you're going to appeal to these people and they're going to leave you alone. I don't know what NASCAR's endgame is on this, but certainly the major cultural entities of the South have capitulated over time to the establishment. And I think this is just another example of that. You can't have the battle flag at NASCAR events now. You have all this happening. What was once a real Southern cultural institution has now changed. And if they do change and they go to these electrified races, and I don't think it's going to happen right away, and this is something they're investigating and how they could do this, they're simply just capitulating to the modern narrative groupthink that combustion engines bad, electric engines good. Of course, you got to charge those electric engines somehow, and you have to create you have to get the metals to do it, which of course is exploitation in places like Africa where they have to produce these metals. You have to charge these batteries, which is going to use a tremendous amount of fossil fuels. So how are you going to do that? I mean, you're going to use coal-fired power plants or other things to charge the batteries. So you're still using fossil fuels, you're just not driving around in a car with it anymore. And again, electric cars have their uses, and I think they're interesting, particularly in areas where you don't really have to drive many miles, and you can just charge it at your house or whatever. You're still using fossil fuels, though. You take away that you have to go fill up at the gas pump, which is kind of nice, but it's not like the electric cars are completely fossil fuel free. They're not. And we were seeing, solar panels and all these things be trashed because in windmills, and they break. They need oil to make them work. I mean, we can never get away from fossil fuels. And the South, of course, has a tremendous amount of fossil fuels. You go to places like Texas, and of course you have coal and in the mountains. So the South is certainly a place that has a positive side on the fossil fuels compared to other parts of the United States. So, but there are, of course, in the West and other areas with fossil fuels as well. But this is certainly something that is an interesting discussion for the South because of the impact of fossil fuels. But I think the piece is funny in some of the things he says. And then, of course, we wrap up the week with a great piece by Clyde Wilson. Clyde, at his best, being a historian. And this is George W. Kendall of New Orleans, America's first war correspondent. It's a story that I actually didn't know anything about. But he was actually born in New Hampshire, but then settled in the South and worked worked in New Orleans for the Picayune. He founded it. This was one of the most important papers in New Orleans, and he went west and wrote about the Texas independence movement and the Mexican War. This is a really interesting part of American history, and of course, more importantly, the Mexican War with the activities in the 1840s. Southerners were fascinated by this time period. And a lot of the major figures, of course, were Southern. Winfield Scott and Zachary Taylor, and where I live, there's a they call it Buena Vista, but it's Buena Vista Road. And that comes from the Battle of Buena Vista, which was an important battle. So Southerners started to name areas where they lived after some of these important battles. We have the Marine Corps anthem, which calls back to the Mexican War. So this is a really important time in American history. And of course, the byproduct of it was the acquisition of the Mexican cession to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which of course is going to help produce so much of this this territory issue, which was the big battleground between the North and South. It wasn't slavery in the abstract. It was the extension of slavery into the territories, and it was a real tangible thing to people in both areas. And again, we're going back to that real tangible thing against abstractions. So this little piece on this Kendall, this war correspondent, is just interesting. Kendall was interested in the wool industry. He founded a sheep ranch in Texas when he lived there, and he passed away in 1867 in Texas. But this is just a really interesting story, and again, part of this discussion about abstractions and ideology and tangible things. And I think we always need to go back to that. The South was a tangible thing for many people. It wasn't just an abstraction. And if we think about Southern history in that way, in real things you can feel, and it was contentment, that makes the entire situation a little different because real tangible things are being destroyed by abstractions. And do we want to be those people? Do we want to destroy things based on an abstraction? This is, Chesterton's fence. Why do you look at a fence? When you look at a fence, you don't just tear it down. You have to keep the fence. You have to ask why the fence is there, and is there a reason for it? Well, it was put there. People put up fences for a reason, not just for an abstraction. They do it for a reason. And so that fence is there to keep something out or keep something in, whatever it is. And that fence becomes a real tangible thing, not just some abstraction. So conservatives, traditionalists don't deal in abstractions. They conserve things that are real and tangible, whereas abstractionists, ideologues, tear those things down. And that's something, this dichotomy is often, is a very important part of this North-South split throughout American history. All right. Hope you enjoyed this Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Until next time, good day.